Jeffrey Scott had built his whole adult life around patience. 10 years as a structural inspector taught him that patience was the difference between a building standing and a building falling. But patience hadn't worked with Claire's body. 3 miscarriages in 4 years. 3 nurseries painted and unpainted. By the time Claire suggested the fertility clinic downtown, Jeffrey would have agreed to anything. What neither of them knew, what nobody at Halcyon Fertility bothered to double-check because the paperwork looked routine, was that Claire had already conceived naturally 2 weeks before her appointment. It happens more than doctors like to admit. A second egg releases. A second conception occurs on top of an existing pregnancy. Superfetation. A word so rare most obstetricians never say it aloud in their careers. So when the embryologist prepared Claire's insemination, working off a mislabeled vial from a donor file that should have been sealed, she was carrying 2 children from that point forward. One was Jeffrey's, conceived in their bed on an ordinary Tuesday. The other belonged, biologically, to a donor named David Reyes. 9 months later, Claire gave birth to twins, Owen and Micah. Fraternal, the doctor said, nothing strange about that. Jeffrey held both boys in the hospital room and felt something in his chest unlock for the first time in 4 years. He never checked which twin looked more like him. Why would he? David Reyes had donated sperm at 19 for rent money and never thought about it again, until he was 34, divorced, and his mother was dying. In her last weeks, guilt loosened something in her. She told him a truth she'd carried for 30 years. David wasn't her biological son. She and her husband had used a donor themselves, back before such things were spoken of at dinner tables. She'd meant to tell him when he was older. Then there was never a right time. Then there was no time left. David sat with that for months. The father he'd loved and buried wasn't his blood. The woman who raised him had lied his entire childhood. He didn't hate her for it, but something in him became fixated on blood in a way it never had been before. He needed to know, was there anything of him, actually him, walking around in the world? He tracked down the fertility clinic he'd donated to at 19, paid a clerk more than he could afford for records that should have stayed sealed, found a single successful match, a boy named Micah Scott, age 6, living 2 hours away with a mother named Claire and a father named Jeffrey. David told himself he only wanted to see him, once, from a distance. He did not stay at a distance for long. For 8 months, David orbited the Scott family's life without ever stepping into it. He learnt their schedule. He learnt that Micah played shortstop, that Owen was the quiet twin, that Jeffrey coached both boys' Saturday league. He told himself this was harmless. Then he told a lawyer friend, hypothetically, what rights a sperm donor might have if paternity were proven and the child's home situation could be shown as unfit or dangerous. The friend told him plainly, courts favor existing families. A biological connection alone rarely moves a judge. You'd need the current father gone. Not divorced, gone. David didn't act on it. Not yet. He told himself he was better than that thought. Then came a Tuesday in October when everything narrowed to a single afternoon. A boy from 2 streets over, a neighbor's son named Caleb Whitfield, 7 years old, same age as the twins, same build, same brown hair, went missing after school. David had watched Caleb before, only because Caleb sometimes played in the same park as Micah and Owen. He knew the boy's routine the way he knew everything else in that neighborhood by then, too well. What happened to Caleb that afternoon is the ugliest part of this story, and it happened at David's hands, in a storage unit David had rented under a name that wasn't his own. David told himself, even as he did it, that he wasn't a killer. He was clearing a path. He was making room for something that belonged to him. He left evidence pointing somewhere else entirely, toward Jeffrey. The fibers were the first thing. Carpet fibers matching Jeffrey's Toyota, planted in the storage unit by a man who'd spent months learning exactly which vehicle Jeffrey drove and exactly how to get access to it during a Saturday practice when the car sat unlocked in a school parking lot for 2 hours. Then came the phone records. A burner registered in a name close enough to Jeffrey's that a sloppy detective didn't look twice, its tower pings placed near the storage facility on 3 separate afternoons that lined up, coincidentally or not. With days Jeffrey had genuinely been running errands nearby. Then came the witness, a man who swore he'd seen Jeffrey's car near the park the day Caleb disappeared. David paid that witness $11,000 in cash, delivered in an envelope left under a doormat. Neither man ever spoke the other's name aloud. The case against Jeffrey built itself into something that looked, on paper, undeniable. He had no real alibi for the hour in question. He'd been alone in his garage, unwitnessed, doing exactly what an innocent man does on an ordinary afternoon. Innocence has no proof. Guilt, when manufactured carefully, does. Jeffrey stood in the courtroom 9 months later and watched a jury of 12 people who had never met him decide, in under 6 hours, that he had murdered a child. Not his own child. That detail confused people at first, until the prosecution built a theory that Jeffrey had mistaken Caleb for someone else, or that some undefined rage had simply needed a target and found one. The theory didn't need to make perfect sense. It only needed to feel plausible enough to close a case that had gripped the town for months. Claire believed him. She was one of perhaps 4 people who did. It didn't matter. Jeffrey was sentenced to life. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, David Reyes sat with his hands folded, his face arranged into the same grief as every other stranger in that room, and felt something close to peace. 6 weeks later, he filed for a paternity test and visitation rights regarding Micah Scott, citing the boy's father's incarceration as grounds for the court to consider a biological parent's claim. Claire didn't fight David directly. She didn't know yet what he was, but something about the timing of his sudden appearance in their lives, 6 weeks after Jeffrey's sentencing, sat wrong in a way she couldn't name. She hired a private investigator named Ruth Alvarez, not to prove Jeffrey's innocence. She didn't yet know that was possible, but to understand who this man was and why he wanted her son. Ruth was thorough in the unglamorous way good investigators are. She didn't chase drama. She pulled property records, employment history, old donor clinic lawsuits from a decade back involving improperly sealed records. She found the paper trail David had assumed no one would ever have reason to look for. The clinic breach, the paid clerk, the storage unit rented under an alias that shared a P.O. box with David's real address. It took her 4 months. What broke the case wasn't a single dramatic discovery, but an accumulation of small, boring facts that only made sense together. A storage unit lease, a burner phone's true owner traced through an unpaid bill mailed to David's actual home, a paid witness who'd bought a truck in cash 2 weeks after Jeffrey's conviction and still hadn't explained where the money came from. Ruth brought it all to a reporter first, not the police. She'd learnt that cases built quietly sometimes got buried quietly too. The reporter, a woman named Denise Okafor, who'd covered the original trial and always felt something hadn't sat right about it, took 8 more months verifying everything before publishing. The story broke on a Sunday morning. By Monday, the district attorney's office had reopened the case. David Reyes was arrested 11 months after Jeffrey's release was finally ordered, the wheels of appeals and re-investigation grinding slower than any of it deserved to. He confessed eventually, not out of conscience but because the physical evidence had become undeniable once investigators knew where to look. He is serving a life sentence now, in the same system that once held the man he framed. Jeffrey walked out of prison 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days after he walked in. Claire was waiting. So were Owen and Micah, 13 years old now, taller than either parent remembered them being allowed to grow. Micah knew by then what David had been to him biologically. It was a fact that existed now and couldn't be unmade. But Jeffrey never once let it sit between them as anything other than a fact. A strange footnote from a fertility clinic's carelessness, nothing more. He'd coached Micah's Saturday games from the boy's first swing of a bat. He'd sat up with him through fevers and read him the same 3 bedtime books until the spines cracked. None of that had ever depended on what a lab report said about shared DNA, and Jeffrey wasn't about to let it start mattering now. "You're my son," he told Micah, the first week home, sitting on the edge of the boy's bed the way he used to when Micah was small enough to still want that. That was never up for a vote. Not his, not a court's, not even mine. Micah didn't say anything back. He didn't need to. He just leaned his head against his father's shoulder the way he had 1,000 times before anyone had ever tried to tell either of them it should be different. Caleb Whitfield's parents got something that year too. Not their son back. Nothing could give them that, but the truth, finally attached to the right name. Denise Okafor's reporting won an award neither she nor the Whitfields felt much like celebrating. Jeffrey never went back to inspecting buildings. He said once, to Claire, that he understood something now about foundations he hadn't understood before. Some of them get built on a lie so small nobody notices it happening, and it's years before anyone finds out what it was quietly holding up the whole time. He spent the rest of his life making sure his own foundation, the one under his family, was built on nothing but what he'd chosen to give it, freely, every single day.